in the February of 2014, fifth grader, 10-year-old, my elder son, Adhan Ahmed, walks up to me and he says he needed some help to prepare for what is called as PYP exhibition. The PYP stands for Primary Year Program in the IB schools. And these exhibitions are essentially put across to showcase what they have learned through the entire session. The theme for that exhibition was sharing the planet, a very profound theme indeed. And of multiple streams in that big theme, things like land rights, water conservation, women empowerment, he chose food security. And he had his rationale for this. I then worked for a food company, Cargill, in Singapore, and I had been passionately advocating about food security. He saw me giving those presentations late in the night to my global colleagues on multiple international calls that some of us in the multinationals are subjected to. Not a great experience, but you have no other choice. Well, we started to do a little bit of research, and I started to help him unravel that food security issue. We were with the issue of feeding 9 billion people by 2050 that this planet will inhabit. This was 2014, and the world's population was 7.2 billion people. There comes a very innocent, juvenile question of a 10-year-old. And he asked me, Baba, calls me Baba, what was the world's population when he was born in 2003? 6.3 billion. What about 2005 when my younger brother Ayan was born? 6.5. What was the population when you were born in 1972? 3.8. What about my grandfather, the Dada? What was the population? When was he born? 1941, 2.3 billion population. And then there's a pause. He's thinking, and then he comes out with a very, very discerning thought. And he says, when Dada was born, he shared this planet with 2.3 billion people. When I was born, I shared it with 6.3 billion people. I do not have the luxury to behave the way my Dada behaved. A very intelligent thought for a 10-year-old, right? Just hold that thought for a moment. Let me take you through the journey of my own childhood. I grew up in a city called Ranchi. My father worked in a public sector unit. He's an engineer called Heavy Engineering Corporation. I grew up exactly in this house. I spent most of my childhood there. It was a 2-bedroom house, and in a block there were 6 families that would live in those 6 apartments. I went to school like this. A little bit of broken benches, but a lot of happiness. I played a lot of cricket. We played cricket even when we did not have these stumps. We could use these stones to make the wickets. We also had a football, which I think was probably gifted to my elder brother, which was passed on to me, and towards the end of its life cycle, it looked something like this, little cracked, little broken, torn, but extensively used. Both my children were born in Delhi. We lived in Delhi, then in Singapore, and we've come back to Gurgaon. They went to schools like these. Because I was an outdoor sports person, I encouraged them to take outdoor sports. They needed some gears to play sports, and that's what they have. I must thank them to pose for this picture in spite of a lot of cajoling, and they have sort of showcased all that gear that they have. If you can count the number of balls, the footballs that is there in the picture, you'll get a goodie at the end of the talk. And do not forget the 2 footballs that they are holding in their hands, which was personally autographed by the legendary Pele himself. Now, this is what they are growing up with. Now, go back to the thought of the population. 2.3 billion people when my father was born. 6.5 when my younger child, Ayan, was born. So population has grown in a big way. But in my household, it hasn't grown. I grew up as two brothers. I have 2 sons. So there's been effectively no growth of population in my family, right? Now, There was a wonderful thought that was propagated by a gentleman called Jason Clay. He is the Senior Vice President and Executive Director of WWF. And he says that if we have to have a sustainable planet, we must have the population multiplied by consumption. It should either be equal to the planet or it should be less than one planet. We have only one planet. We cannot consume more than a planet. The bad news is that in the early 1990s, we have already started to consume more than one planet. And as I speak to you today, we're consuming anything close to about 1.3 planet on a daily basis. Now, this cannot go on. It's not a sustainable relationship. We cannot control the population. So what can we control? Probably consumption, right? That's the conventional wisdom. That's not right. What is a responsible consumption? We have to get into the mindset of a responsible consumption, which, by the way, is not underconsumption. For those of you who studied economics, you know that consumption is one of the important parameters of an economic growth. For an emerging economy like ours, we can't say that we will control the consumption. What we need to do is to create an atmosphere, a culture of responsible consumption. Now, when we typically look at value chain, we look at the value chain of production. Just take the example of food. Farm inputs, farming, harvesting, processing, retail, consumption. Stops at consumption. Any production value chain that we look at stops at the consumption. And this is my idea, ladies and gentlemen, to you, that we have to start a value chain that starts at consumption, does not stop at consumption. How can we do that? Now, if you really look at what we consume on a daily basis, there is a life cycle of what we consume, right? And life cycle can be defined in many ways. It can just be a single use production. Now, imagine if we say that we bring down the consumption of our children to the level that we have grown up with. That's just not possible, right? How can you think of this generation, which is born even after the millennials, to go back to the 70s and 60s or 40s or 50s? Not possible. How do we define the life cycle? How many of you are sitting in this audience are married? Can you raise your hand? Wow, a good number of you. What did you wear on your? All these gorgeous ladies wore wonderful, expensive bridal wear. The men got to wear sherwanis, most of us. The most expensive dress we bought? Mostly yes. Okay. How many times did we use it after our wedding? Twice, thrice, probably once, never after that. Some of us have used it for the younger siblings' wedding or the first cousin's wedding, probably a couple of times. Most of us, in a few years of our married life, have actually outgrown that dress, which is a sign of prosperity. Wonderful, right? Now, imagine a biggest investment into something which we are not using more than once. I did a smart thing for my wedding. What did I do? I went and borrowed a sherwani for my wedding. There's an Indian tradition. Your in-laws typically give you money to go and make your sherwani for your wedding, right? I have a very generous and a magnanimous mother-in-law. She gave me a lot of money at that point in time. She said, "Beta, take this, go make a sherwani." It was a lot of money for me. I wasn't doing very well in my career. I was hard on cash. I looked at that money and said, do I buy a sherwani which I'm only going to use once? I took that money quietly. Those of you who are familiar with Delhi, when you go to the airport, on the left-hand side, there are all these factory outlets, wonderful factory outlets that will give you the best of the brands at 50%, 40%, 60% discount. I went there and shopped jeans, t-shirts, shirts, trousers, and I wore it for next 5 years. I wore a borrowed sherwani on my wedding, a sin that I've committed and not been forgiven by my wife for 16 years. But so be it, one has to live with it. And I realized that that was probably the smartest thing I did besides marrying my wife, which is even a more intelligent thing to do, at the time of my wedding. So that's one important thing all of us can do. We can create our own life cycle and say, okay, if this is what we are going to use this many number of times, what is the consumption cycle, or what is the extended responsibility of that consumption as we go forward? Typically, the onus of extended responsibility is put on the producer. Many of us know that there are millions and millions of smartphones that is being manufactured. This is also creating a huge amount of electronic waste, right? Now, most of the governments in the world have come out with what they call the extended producer responsibility, which means that if I am Apple and I am creating an iPhone, I am responsible for the entire life cycle of this iPhone. Doesn't matter who's consuming it. And I have to make sure that this lives through its entire life cycle, recycled and discarded in a responsible manner, and does not end up as an electronic waste. What we need now, ladies and gentlemen, is the extended consumer responsibility. Nobody asked me a question if this is just a year-old iPhone 6 and I know that I'm already looking forward to iPhone 7 and I'll discard it somewhere. Am I not committing a mistake? Am I not responsible to make sure that there is an extended life of this product which should be consumed, if not by me, by somebody who needs it? We live in a beautiful country. We live in a country where the per capita emission is almost 10 times lower than a developed nation like the United States, or 20 times lower than a Gulf nations like Qatar or Kuwait. But do we realize that living in Gurgaon, Delhi, Mumbai, our per capita emission is roughly about 16 or 17 times more than our cousins living in the rural area? If we extend our consumption cycle and make sure that this reaches the people who deserve it and need it, we will extend that carbon emission for a longer period of time. So that's first thought. Define your own life cycle of the consumption that you do. Second interesting thought is define your limit. I have started to do that, and that limit can be anything. If I need a 10 pair of shoes, let there be a 10 pair of shoes as my limit. I know in today's modern world, we need multiple pair of shoes. You need a running shoes. If you're a golfer, you need a golf shoes, tennis shoes, some formal shoes for executive like me. Okay, give you 10 pair of shoes. Now, after you have the 10 pair of shoes, you're walking in a mall, and when you see that your favorite brand is on discount on an annual sale at 50%, you cannot resist buying another one. By all means, buy it. Bring it home. Open the shoe racks. Let that pair of shoes be your 10th pair of shoes and not the 11th pair of shoes. Take one out, even if it is very, very close to your heart. Go and take a very hard look at our wardrobe. Trust me, I do it every 2 months, 3 months. And my wardrobe looks like a dump yard. I have shirts which I haven't worn for more than 6 months, a year. There are shoes that you have never worn for the last 1 year. We just believe that I am going to use it at some point in time, and therefore you keep it in your wardrobe. Let your wardrobe not become the dump yard. Take things out which you have not consumed for past 3 months, 6 months, or whatever is your time period. We have to create a network of people. I have friends, families, communities. We as a family have started to create a network where we can pass it on some of those things which we are not consuming on a regular basis. By doing this, we are creating that there's an extended life cycle of the product that we consume. There's an extended family or universe which is consuming things that we can consume at the first hand and then pass it on. Just remember one thing. Oftentimes we malign the production and we say that anything that is produced in this world has an ecological footprint. But it also has a social footprint. It has an emotional, economical, family footprint. And one cannot talk about this in a better place than Bhilwara, which is an industrial town, where hundreds and thousands of families have been benefited from what is produced out of the textile industry of Bhilwara. So there is an emotional, social footprint of production. Consumption is good as long as we consume responsibly. I know when I talk to my children and I talk to their generation, and I talk to myself, these are difficult discussions to have. We know it's a difficult future to achieve, but it's a future that is achievable and is worth achieving. Thank you very much.